Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you today to today's online discussion. I'm Scott Thuma, the director of Hartford Institute for Religion Research. I'm also the project manager for some of the data that we're talking about, and I'm a professor of sociology of religion at Hartford International University. Today's presentation delves into alterations that have been a result of the pandemic that we all know impacted congregations, the technological changes to how they function. This is our fourth presentation in the series of lunchtime webinars hosted by Hartford Institute and HIU. On March 7th and subsequent first Thursdays each month, we're going to begin a new monthly offering, beginning with the continued discussion of clergy health and wellness dynamics that we started a few weeks ago. Hartford Institute for Religion Research has more than 40 years of engaged, rigorous research on faith communities and the study of religious leaders and religious organizations. We are attempting to continue to trace and anticipate emerging trends and issues and look at those in our research. Our institute is the only academic research institute in the country that focuses specifically on this organizational life of congregations. And we hope these webinars make our research further available to religious leaders. So today, we've invited one of our collaborating partners, the Network for New Media, Religion, and Digital Culture Studies, and Dr. Heidi Campbell to discuss her research, along with our findings from the Hartford Institute's 5-year grant-funded project, the Exploring the Pandemic Impact on Congregation, or EPIC. That's an effort to collect and disseminate information about the long-term changes that COVID-19 has had on religious life in the US. We're very happy to welcome all of you here today and to invite you to join this conversation on what we're learning and how this information on tech findings may be relevant and useful to you and your work in ministry. It should be a great conversation. We will post the recording of this webinar and the previous ones on our website at covidreligionresearch.org, so please take a look at that. But now I'd like to introduce the presenters for today. First, we have Dr. Heidi Campbell, and she's the professor of communications and a presidential impact fellow at Texas A&M University. And I believe today is joining us from Rome, Italy, where she's lecturing. Heidi is the director of the Network for New Media, Religion, and Digital Culture Studies, and is really considered one of the founders and foremost experts in the study of digital religion. Her research focuses on how religious groups negotiate their use and understanding of technology. She's published well over 100 articles and many books, including Digital Religion, Networked Theology, Digital Creatives and the Rethinking of Religious Authority, and Ecclesiology for a Digital Church. I'm so happy to have her with us. Additionally, we have her former student, Sophia Osteen, a current doctoral student in clinical psychology at Wheaton College. She'll also join us in the presentation. I'll let them introduce their data set and their research project, Tech in Churches, that they'll be speaking from. We'll also hear today from Dr. Carissa McCoskey, one of our research postdoctoral fellows in the EPIC project. Carissa is the author of our just about to be released report on technology, which she'll speak about some today. Dr. McCoskey provides quantitative data analysis for our project, as well as does most of the survey management. Her PhD is from Purdue University with a focus on sociology of religion, and her past research experiences include work with the Pew Research Center, Presbyterian Church, and the Confirmation Project. I'm sure our thoughts are going to be stimulated today by these excellent presenters. Also, please know that throughout these presentations, you can use the question and answer chat feature to raise questions that come to mind during the session. And we'll try to address as many of those as we can during our question and answer time later in the hour. But before we begin, I'd like to turn it over to Katie O'Leary, the Director of Continuing and Professional Education here at Hartford International University. Please take it away, Katie.
Good afternoon, and thanks. Continuing in Professional Education is an initiative here at HIU, and I want to just give you a little definition and show you how we kind of fit into this. We're a platform. It's where HIU features learning opportunities, things like this, in a religiously complex world. It's also where we highlight programming like today's by the Institute. And you can also think of it as sort of a portal. If you're, say, a non-degree seeking student, you could audit, you could come to us for workshops, for trainings. So that's what continuing in professional education is. And one of the things that I am excited to have you be on the lookout for coming up is a couple of webinars that we are planning on anti-Jewish and anti-Muslim bigotry. Now, the best way to stay in touch with programming like today's or what I just mentioned is to sign up for our weekly, and I promise it is just weekly, it's on Fridays, our weekly HIU news that will come to you by email first thing Friday morning. So in the chat, there's a link to sign up. If you don't know if you're already signed up, chances are you are not, and I hope you will. Good to be in the room with you today.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here today. I'll be starting off our webinar talking about the Tech in Churches project and looking specifically at kind of what we have learned over the last 3 years on churches' use of technology and how far we've come and some of the continued challenges that there are. So a little bit about background about our data. We started out with this research question in 2020. What did COVID-19 pandemic teach religious congregations about religious institutions' relationship to digital technology? And so we began through the help of the Lilly Endowment in Indianapolis. And this project was in conjunction with the Center for Congregations. The Center for Congregations was able to give some grants out at the very early part of the pandemic to churches who were struggling and trying to think about, well, what do we do now that there's a lockdown, now that there's social distancing? And the Lilly Endowment, as well as the center, quickly saw that there was a need for churches to have some resources available. And so through $5,000 grants that they were able to give, they 2,700 congregations in the state of Indiana benefited from this program. But this is where my team stepped in. We wanted to, with the help of the Lilly Endowment, follow these churches over the course of their time using this technology to see, this is where this is the technology that we thought we were going to use. Did that actually become the technology that they used in the end? What was that learning process like? And where are they now, 2 years later in that process? So it was a great opportunity to follow these congregations, and this was a diverse sample of congregations. We had mostly Protestant and Catholic, but there was also a few Jewish synagogues and some Muslim congregations as well. And we were able to kind of see what were some of the challenges that they looked at and how they overcame them. So for this project specifically, there was 3 bits of data that we went through and kind of gleaned from. And so kind of 3 sets of reports that we produced over the course of the pandemic. The first one and the first stage of research was really looking at how religious leaders were making decisions about technology. So as part of this program and this grant that they received, there were tech talks scheduled by the Center for Congregations. These were both practical sessions to help churches and leaders that maybe weren't very technology informed or up to date, how to kind of maybe work with the technology or what technology they should be purchasing. And they also were, these became sessions where they could kind of process what were the strengths and the weaknesses of using technology, what were some of their successes, and where were they challenging. So we used the narratives and transcripts from 50 different sessions with over 400 leaders talking about their decision-making about technology. On the second stage of research, we looked at the applications that they wrote, basically requesting in early 2020 what they thought they needed technologically to kind of get their churches online and get moving. And then we compared that data and those narratives of hope and enthusiasm with reports that they wrote a year later saying what they actually did with the resources that they were given, what were their successes, and what they learned about technology. And that led to our second report, looking at kind of the culture of churches and technology. And in the third report, which was just came out at the end, late 2023, we looked at the kind of the future of the hybrid church, and we were able to go back to those churches and we had surveys done with leaders from the church to find out a little bit more in depth about how they saw the early days of the pandemic and then farther on, and also where they were at right now, what were the continued challenges and opportunities, and where did they see technology fitting into the life of their church. So this gives you a little kind of a slice of kind of the data that we work with, these 3 stages of reports. And what we're going to do today is I'm going to offer just some quick insights into some of the early reports from findings from stage 1, and then my senior research assistant, Sophie Osteen, is going to step in and give you some highlights from stage 3 about where churches are at now and what that kind of says about what churches still need and still are learning about technology in churches. So, as we looked at the narratives of these pastors who, again, in 2020, we saw a lot of fear as well as a lot of excitement about technology. And there was truly the sense about moving churches online. There was a sense of being quite conflicted. Some of these areas of kind of conflict results were related to that not all the congregations were kind of excited about this technology. For many of the congregations, the technology was seen as a stopgap and something that they had to use, but they had never actually even entertained the idea of being an online congregation or webcasting their services. And so kind of one continued challenge for pastors in that first year of the pandemic was kind of dealing with technologically hesitant congregations or even resistant people actually working against or pushing against the technology that they were trying to get up to speed. Another one of the kind of conflictual or challenging areas that churches experienced really early on was the idea of adding a new ministry to their church, a tech team. The tech team sometimes was maybe a member of the who was using the soundboard and was given a crash course on how to use a computer. Sometimes it was a member of the youth group or even the youth pastor who was brought on. And so it was a challenge of how do we create this new ministry and who do we bring on to kind of help us get through this technological challenge, but also how do we now see the tech team as a new part of ministry and a new part of the team that's very essential, especially during the pandemic. And then the third really kind of a challenge area that a lot of churches and leaders were talking about was how do we deal with the limits of what technology can or can't do, not just in the practical ways, but in the theological implications. So, what happens when we have to change the liturgy of the service because we have a camera right in front of the church? And if we do the Eucharist or we do kind of parts of the service in the way that we normally do, people would be cut off and not be able to be seen. So there was a lot of kind of changes and innovations that had to happen that required not just technological change, but rethinking what services would look like. And again, sometimes, what seemed like an easy or just a very utilitarian choice created a lot of waves and a lot of discomfort in different people in having to make that change. And these are all findings that came out of this first report that we wrote when pastors put on the tech hat. And they described that tech hat was one of the most kind of uncomfortable things they had to do during the pandemic because it was the one they felt least prepared for. So from report 1, we ended up writing 2 what we call tech trend papers, looking at some issues in more depth. So one of the things that came out of the first report in those early days of the pandemic was that religious leaders were not prepared, and pastors, for the digital skills they needed. And there's really 3 areas that they were not prepared. At one level, it was just many of them lacked basic media experience. They didn't know how to use a video camera, or they didn't even know how to use a soundboard in the church already had, let alone thinking about buying a computer or getting a digital camera. And so this was one area of kind of challenge and discomfort. Another thing they had is not just kind of understanding media works and what media components they would need to webcast their service, but just general issues of digital knowledge. Just being aware of like, okay, what are their social platform options besides Facebook? How does YouTube work versus Facebook when it comes to webcasting services? And so just not having even the nuanced understanding of especially social media created a lot of challenges when they just were even sitting down to say, well, what platform do we want to actually use, or should we use to webcast our services? What's one going to have the easiest learning curve and maybe the least kind of problems for people practically to log on, as well as causing challenges in just people's understanding of what online church was about. And then a third area of lack was not just kind of the general media experience or digital knowledge, but was just a kind of a general understanding of digital literacy. One of our the leaders said that I feel wildly unacquainted with internet culture. It's not just not knowing what tools or resources, but just how things work. And a lot of the sense of there was this huge levels of anxiety and fear created by having to make technology choices when those skills and knowledge were not there. For example, none of the pastors that we talked to had ever had a technology class related to their seminary training, pastoral training, or even internships they had done. If they did have any technological knowledge, it was because they were maybe they had spent time on the internet, or maybe a member of their church or a child or grandchild had taught them. And so we see that kind of the fact that technological learning has not been part of the kind of training of religious leaders became a huge kind of point for us thinking about and talking with how do we, for the next generation of religious leaders, prepare them for these skills. And the second tech trend paper we produced was looking at embracing entrepreneurship. So not only did pastors feel kind of anxiety and worry because they didn't have the tech skills that they needed, but they also sometimes felt like, well, we don't even have the kind of temperament or kind of character traits that we're being asked to use. So when we think of what is a pastor, what are the markers of them? We think about someone who's a good teacher. They're a good counselor, so they're good interpersonally. They have compassion, and they're kind of an overseer. They're able to organize things and have accountability. These are all important parts of kind of traditional pastor work. But when it comes to do technology planning, technology management, and especially thinking about when problems happen on a live service, the traits that most of the pastors listed were things like, well, I needed to be willing to experiment or feel comfortable being able to experiment with technology. Online church services caused me to really be adaptable, to think on my feet in ways I never had to think before. The service was, it's not about just advanced planning, but being prepared for making those choices when the feed goes down, etc. Creative thinking, being willing to get things wrong, so in trial and error. So these are traits. What we found that when we looked at what traits or characteristics do you feel like you needed to use to go online, these were the traits that they mentioned. And these are traits that are more commonly associated with entrepreneurship rather than pastoral ministry. And so this created, again, another level of stress, not just I don't know the technology, but I'm now being forced to put in a kind of certain leadership environment and attitude that I'm not even prepared for. And so what we learned is that, when we think about preparing not just for change and for dealing with crisis situation, but some of these traits that, again, when we more kind of conducive or that people would develop in kind of business areas are things that we need to maybe encourage or incorporate in opportunities for learning and training of pastors so that they aren't afraid, when things go wrong with the technology, but also they're more willing and able to adapt in times of crisis and change. So these were some of the early kind of stages, challenges that were felt. And I'm now going to turn it over to my RA, Sophie Osteen, to talk about some of the key findings that looking forward and then looking now 3 years later, where churches are at in their views of technology.
Yes, thank you. Great to be with everyone today. I think one of the benefits that we're going to get to talk about is getting to compare some of the things we were seeing initially during the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on churches, so in 2020, and the benefit of getting to compare them to findings from the last couple of years where we're really in a post-pandemic era. And so I will kind of go through some of these, and I think it's important to also kind of give some background as to what report 3 is. So our third report, which is what the data that I'm about to go over, this data is about a survey that we sent out to all of the recipients of the grant money from endowment. So a lot of these people, we talked about that thousands of people received this $5,000 grant, and we sent out a survey asking, what were the challenges and what are you now, 3 years later experiencing? So we had 246 church leaders respond, which isn't surprising because a variety of people responded and said, I no longer work at the church, or for whatever reason, the normal kind of pastoral turnover. So out of the respondents, most of them, so 60%, were paid full-time staff. And just kind of our own analysis, majority of those people were the pastors or the, worship pastors or some of these main kind of critical people. The average age of these people were 52. So the youngest we had was 24, the oldest was 78. And the vast majority were white, which is consistent with the findings from the overall research, but also we did have, some consistent with the breakdown of demographics in Indiana as well. So 14% were Black and 2% Hispanic, and then a smaller percentage were Asian. And I think what's important to note here is that the majority were from small churches in small towns, so rural areas, so under 100 people. So as you guys can see on the right, like around 52% of respondents were coming from churches with congregations smaller than 99, and by far the smallest majority was their smallest was over 500 people, only 7%. And so really, I think that sets a good framework for how to think through this data, is this data was coming from people that were existing in small churches that were in more rural areas. So one of the things that we found, one of the important findings from this research, was looking at the view of the relationship between religion and technology, which really just means, how do you see technology benefiting or not benefiting, or what are the challenging ways you see the relationship between the church or the mosque or the synagogue and digital technology, which a lot of people were introduced for the first time in 2020. And what we found is that pre-pandemic, there were maybe more hesitant responses, because you guys can see 37% said they were connected, but we still had, the majority of people saying, they weren't connected, somewhat connected, or just, not connected at all, which 16% responded. And on the right, you can see now we're looking at the current relationship. So this is 3 years later. How do you view the relationship between religion and technology? And whereas we had 7% before, now we have 33% of people saying they view it as completely necessary. So technology is completely necessary, and that relationship is necessary or integral or connected. So the vast majority is saying it's either connected or just completely 100% needed. Whereas, you can see here that 0.4% said disconnected, or 7% said somewhat connected. So again, I think what we're highlighting here is that pre-pandemic to post-pandemic, there's a wider acceptance of the relationship between technology, and even seeing it as pretty necessary to the way that the church or the religious congregation is going to function moving forward. So one of the other things that we were interested in looking at this data is if there were any shifts in terms of the type of use of technology. And so as you guys can see here, we have pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, and the two most notable findings that we had were for live streaming, so the use of live streaming, and also the use of Facebook to connecting members. And what we found is that pre and post-pandemic, people responded that they didn't use, Facebook or live streaming a lot, and post-pandemic, they're using it frequently, and they see Facebook and live streaming as more integral to the functioning of their church as well. And so out of all of the different, Wi-Fi, Twitter, out of all the different social media platforms and technological uses that we looked at, the greatest increase was for live streaming and Facebook. And so we also looked at the correlation of the age of the leader. So we were interested in, if this is a pastor, might there be differences in how they respond to social media and their age? And the reason we were interested in that is, data outside even of this field shows that the people that engage with different forms of social media are going to be different ages. So probably the stereotype you heard, like Facebook, generally you don't see being used among younger congregations now, and it's an older group on Facebook now. Whereas Instagram is typically utilized by a younger group of people. And what we found is pretty consistent with what's intuitive. So people that use the website, whereas so in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s is pretty consistent. They're using it a lot. And whereas Facebook, if you guys can see on Facebook, as the group of people get older, the use of Facebook increases. So people that are in their 60s and 70s actually use Facebook the most as compared to 20s and 30s or 40s and 50s. And again, kind of consistent with, I think, what we'd see as intuitive, people in their 60s to 70s use Instagram the least. So they said they don't use it at all. And that decreases as you get younger. So there's more engagement with Instagram in the younger populations, like 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s of church leaders than the older ones. So again, kind of a bird's eye view is that depending on the age of the church leader who's making these technological decisions, you're going to see differences in the type of digital technology that they choose to utilize. And then I think what we are wanting to get across here as well is that we were interested in, if the pandemic altered congregation, so not the leaders themselves, but the congregants' understanding of technology in general. And so we asked these questions, did the pandemic alter how you view the relationship between digital technology and religious congregations? And, most people said not. But, we had 60%, 70% saying it changed it completely, 20% saying changed completely, or it changed it in most ways. So we're seeing that the majority of people, it did change it in some ways, the way that they viewed digital tech and their religious congregation. And in general, the congregation's view of technology is more positive now as we're ending the pandemic and we're getting more used to technology use in churches. These pastors and church leaders are saying, our congregation responds well to technology now. So again, you're seeing mostly positive, 28%, 29%, and more positive, whereas the minority is mostly negative, 2% and more negative 0.5. So again, what you can take away from this is that church leaders and their congregations are responding overall well to technology and see it as a very integral piece of the way that churches and mosques and synagogues and in general religious community runs. So I'll hand it over back to Dr. Campbell.
So just to quickly kind of wrap up our part of the presentation. So one thing we're noticing is that, even though we've gone through this great time of learning and there was a lot of learning curves, there was levels of discomfort, and now we're having much more of a positive relationship to technology, that doesn't mean all technological problems have been solved. So two kind of trends that we're seeing, especially from the data from report 3, is that many churches are still struggling with the digital divide. And the digital divide is a concept of saying that, that there's often a divide between who has access and knowledge about technology and getting access to that technology. So that many churches were in a digital divide before the pandemic. They didn't have Wi-Fi in their churches. They didn't have any ability to live stream, and that's why the grant was so important. But at the same time, a lot of these churches that invested in these videos and cameras because technology moves so quickly, some of them are struggling with realizing their computers or the programs they're using are out of date and they have to update, and that requires more resources. Other churches thought that hey, we need this program or we needed a Zoom license. And then they found that actually they needed some other kind of software or platform because what they bought was either too complex or maybe not adaptable with their sound system, for instance. And so the digital divide is still impacting many churches. They may have technology, but they still need to be funded. They still need resources, and they still need continued learning about the best digital resources out there. A second finding that we have found is that, most churches, especially after spending so much time, money, and energy to get wired and get online, they really kind of see that ending that would be somewhere between unwise stewardship and just unwise in terms of congregants coming back. Some churches have seen that not as many people have come back into the pews post-pandemic, and so offering that online option allows them to stay connected to that. And so this move toward hybrid church becoming the perceived norm or even the desired norm is a trend that we're definitely seeing in the data. And oftentimes this is, again, causes a new level of challenge between the technologically hesitant and resistant and other members of the church, because it's really the young people that want that option to be available. And it's also the young people that the churches are dependent on to keep them up to date and help be part of the tech team. So, as we look ahead, the church still has learning it needs to do about technology. It still needs resources, and it still needs to deal with digital hesitancy as we think about what the new normal could be for churches. And so with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Carissa to talk about the EPIC data and what kind of echoes some of our findings.
So as Dr. Campbell said, I'm going to talk about the findings from the Exploring the Pandemic Impact on Congregations study and the Faith and Communities Today research initiative. So back in 2015, less than a decade ago, when congregational leaders were asked about their opinion on the use of internet technologies such as email, social media, texting, about 30% of them said that these technologies can be quite helpful, but are not really crucial for the congregation's vitality or success. Then, 5 years later, entered COVID-19, and suddenly worship services look a bit more like this. Today, I will go over some of what we are finding in our large national survey data regarding congregations and their use of technology. I will talk about how congregations use technology in 2023, how this has changed since 2020 and throughout the course of the pandemic, and how it is reshaping congregational dynamics. The data I talk about here primarily come from the spring 2023 Exploring the Pandemic Impact on Congregations survey, which was conducted in partnership with the Faith and Communities Today research initiative and the 2020 Faith and Communities Today survey. The 2023 data is nationally representative and contains responses from over 5,000 congregations in more than 57 Christian denominations and 5 non-Christian religious groups. First, I will talk about the use of technology in worship and other programming, and then later I will talk about technology tools that congregations are using. In 2023, 75% of congregations had adopted online or virtual worship. For comparison, only about 45% of congregations surveyed pre-lockdown in 2020 were doing live streaming, and only about half of those were doing it frequently or always. Most of these congregations that have a virtual worship option are in a hybrid format with both in-person and online attenders. 73% of congregations are hybrid, while 25% are in-person only and 2% are online only. There are a few differences by religious tradition when it comes to having online worship. Catholic and Orthodox Christian congregations are most likely to have in-person only services, with nearly half of these congregations having in-person only. Traditions outside of the Christian faith are more likely than Christian congregations to have online only worship, with about 6% opting for this method. There are also some differences in offering virtual worship by the size of the congregation. Small congregations, meaning less than 50 people in attendance, are more likely to be in-person only, while 92% of congregations larger than 250 attenders are hybrid. The use of hybrid worship has changed a little bit since the start of the pandemic. Our first EPIC survey of Christian congregations in the summer of 2021 found that about 80% of congregations were offering hybrid services. By 2023, this percent has decreased slightly to 73%. Similarly, the percent of Christian congregations meeting in person only has increased from 15% in 2021 to 25% in 2023. The most common platforms used for virtual worship in 2023 are social media such as Facebook or Instagram, video hosting platforms such as YouTube or their own website, and video conferencing software such as Zoom or WebEx. A few congregations use audio platforms such as the radio, a podcast, or the telephone, and very few congregations use television. We find that over half of congregations use only one platform for their virtual worship, while nearly a third use 2 platforms and 13% use 3 or more platforms for their virtual worship. In 2023, most congregations who offer virtual worship do so weekly or more often. Only a handful of congregations who offer virtual worship do so less frequently than weekly. This is a dramatic change from the data on congregations surveyed pre-lockdown in 2020, where only 26% of congregations who had a live stream of their service provided this option frequently or always. The group of congregations offering virtual worship in 2023 were asked if they plan to continue to offer this practice into the future, and 4 out of 5 agreed that they will still have this option 5 years from now. Only less than 3% think they will not continue having online worship, while the rest are unsure. For the most part, it looks like virtual worship, or at least a version of it, is here to stay. For hybrid congregations who count their number of online attendees, we have created a ratio of their in-person to online attenders and grouped them based on being mostly virtual, the dark blue bar, about equal in-person and online, the green bar, more in-person than online, the light blue bar, or much more in-person than online, the orange bar. In 2021, about a fifth of congregations had more virtual attenders than in-person attenders. Very few had an equal ratio. 2/3 of congregations had more in-person attenders than virtual, and only 11% had more than 6 in-person attenders for every 1 virtual attender. This ratio distribution has changed some over the past 2 years. In 2023, 13% of hybrid congregations have more virtual attenders than in-person. About 7% have an equal ratio. 49% have more in-person than virtual, and 31% have much more in-person attenders, meaning they have on average more than 6 in-person people for every 1 virtual person. One result we have found in the 2023 data is that not all hybrid worship is the same. In this graph, the dark blue bars are the median number of virtual attenders, and the green bars are the median number of in-person attenders. The light blue bars are the median number of total in-person plus virtual attenders, and the orange bars are the median number of active participants. Along the bottom, the clusters go from more virtual than in-person folks on the far left, all the way to mostly in-person than virtual on the right. On the left end of the spectrum, hybrid congregations that have more virtual attenders than people gathered in person have a high total number of worship attendees, but only about half of them are considered regular active participants by the leader of their congregation. On the other end of the hybrid worship spectrum, hybrid congregations that are mostly gathered in person with just a few virtual attendees have an even higher total number of worship attendees, and almost 3/4 of them are reported as regular participants. This suggests different levels of participation by the virtual and in-person attenders. Continuing with this in-person to virtual worship attender ratio, there are also differences among hybrid congregations when it comes to examining their growth rates. Hybrid congregations who have more of their worship attendees online as compared to gathered in person have more than doubled in size compared to their pre-pandemic numbers. This is likely attributed to online participation, which may not have been an important part of their worship before the pandemic. As the ratio of online worship to in-person attendees changes in favor of more people gathered together physically, the growth rate diminishes. Hybrid congregations who have many more in-person attenders than virtual attenders are roughly 10% smaller than they were in 2019. The opposite pattern emerges when we look at the per capita giving amount across the hybrid worship spectrum. Hybrid congregations that are mostly virtual have a per capita giving rate of just over $1,000 per person. This amount increases as the ratio shifts towards more in-person attendees. Hybrid congregations who have many more in-person attendees than virtual attendees report a per capita of almost $2,500. This could suggest that in-person attenders contribute more financially to their congregation than their online counterparts. In addition to technologically enhanced worship opportunities, we asked congregations about their use of technology for other programming. We find that while many congregations offered programs such as religious education and fellowship online early in the pandemic, most congregations have done away with the virtual component of many of these programs by 2023. For example, looking here at the fellowship opportunities with data for summer 2021 in the bottom and spring 2023 on the top bar, the percentages of congregations that offer fellowship events either exclusively online or in a hybrid fashion, the light blue and orange segments, has drastically decreased between 2021 and 2023. A similar pattern is evident with several of the other programs we ask about, namely community service opportunities, religious education for children, and youth programs. In 2023, very few congregations offer online-only or hybrid options for these programs. The two exceptions to this pattern were religious education for adults and prayer groups, where we still see some, albeit a good many fewer, congregations offering a hybrid or virtual option to these programs in 2023 compared to 2021. This pattern is interesting to consider in light of the fact that nearly 3/4 of congregations are offering worship online, but not these other components of congregational life. This raises the question of what is the experience of a virtual worship attender if the only part of the organization they can participate in is worship? Are they merely spectators for an hour a week, or are they actually a part of the congregation? I will turn now to a discussion of the technology tools that congregations utilize more broadly in their functioning. Congregations use a variety of technology tools in their normal operations. Specifically, in 2023, shown in green here, we ask about the use of email, texting, online giving, social media for both connection with their people and for events, using video projection and services, having a sermon archive, e-newsletters, and holding either administrative meetings or small group meetings online. Each of these tech tools were used by at least 50% of congregations in our 2023 data. The tool used the most is email, with 96% of congregations using this, and the tool used the least is small group meetings online, with only 53% of congregations using this. The mean number of tools used by a congregation in 2023 is 7, meaning that most congregations are utilizing a variety of technology tools. We asked about several of these same technologies in 2020, and those numbers are shown in blue. Several of these tools, such as email and texting, are not new to congregations, while others, however, have become more widely used in the past 3 years. Not only are the kinds of tech tools and the total number of them implemented by a congregation interesting, so is the amount of emphasis a congregation puts on these tools. Most of these technologies are not new innovations over the past 3 years, but they have been used differently since the pandemic. We find that compared to congregations surveyed pre-lockdown in 2020, congregations in 2023 are more likely to use tech at all, but they are also more likely to use these tools a lot. For example, the percentage of congregations who never use online meetings, the dark blue bars, has gone down. About 65% of pre-lockdown 2020 congregations never use this, to almost 40% of congregations in 2023 do not use this. But also, the percent who say they use online meetings a lot, the orange bars on the far right, has increased from less than 10% in 2020 to almost 20% in 2023. We find similar patterns of using these tools at all and also increasing the use of them in other technologies we are able to compare to 2020, e-newsletters, online giving, texting, having a sermon archive, using video projection during services, and email. Overall, our findings show that the use of technology tools is up even in just the past 3 years. These findings raise the question of whether or not this usage will continue into the future or follow the pattern we noted with the diminished offering of programs online. Additionally, what difference will this technological usage make in the dynamics and functioning of congregations over time? I want to focus on the use of one technology tool in particular, online giving. Back in 2015, very few congregations were using online giving. About 70% of congregations reported that they did not use it at all on the left, and only 8% of congregations said they used it a lot on the right. By 2020, 5 years later, online giving was starting to catch on. Only half of congregations at that point said they never used it, and a quarter of congregations say they use it a lot. Since then, the use of online giving has continued to grow. In 2023, 31% of congregations said they do not use online giving, about 7% say they use it a little, 14% use it some, and 48% use it a lot. This is an example of the pandemic accelerating or reinforcing trends that were already starting to happen. The use of online giving is important because we find that median per capita giving is higher for congregations who emphasize online giving. The median per capita for those who do not utilize online giving is about $1,800, and this increases all along the range of emphasizing online giving until those congregations who use it a lot, who have a per capita of over $2,400. This is a range of over $600. Important to note here is that the positive relationship between emphasizing online giving and per capita persists even when controlling for the size of the congregation, their religious tradition, and their urban or rural location. Going back to the idea of how many different tech tools a congregation uses, there are some interesting correlations between the number of technology tools used and other characteristics of the congregation. For example, when dividing congregations into thirds based on their technology use, low tech, the dark blue bars, medium tech, the green bars, and high tech, the light blue bars, the high tech congregations are more likely to strongly agree that their congregation is spiritually vital and alive on the right than their low or medium tech counterparts. Similarly, high-tech congregations score higher on an optimism scale we created based on the congregation's willingness to change and self-assessment of how they are emerging from the pandemic. This is seen in the light blue bar in the far right cluster. Conversely, low-tech congregations are more likely to be in the low optimism group on that scale, the dark blue bar in the left cluster. These correlations remain true once accounting for the size of the congregation. This correlation between being high-tech and being highly optimistic could indicate that using several forms of technology has helped congregations throughout the pandemic and aided them in efforts to stay in contact with their people over the last 3 years. However, it is also possible that a congregation who is not thriving and therefore not vital nor optimistic right now does not have the energy or resources to implement the use of technology tools. This could mean that there is some reverse or mutual causality at play here. But nevertheless, there seems to be an interesting association between technology use and measures of congregational thriving. In conclusion, technology is an important tool for congregations that facilitates online worship services for a majority of congregations, as well as some programmatic offerings, and is also used in the routine operations of congregations. The use of this kind of technology has increased in even the past 3 years, both in starting to use new tools and relying more heavily on those that were already implemented. I want to leave you with a few questions to ponder in light of the findings presented here. First, given the large percentage of congregations who indicate that they will have online or virtual worship in the near future, what will online or virtual worship look like in 5 years? What aspects of how congregations do it now will remain, and what will need to be adapted for long-term usage? Next, given the large percentage of congregations that offer online worship, but a dwindling number of congregations who offer online options for their other programs, what is the experience of an online worship participant in the broader life of the congregation? And what does this mean for congregational belonging? Are people who opt for this mode of worship just spectators or something more? How might congregations and their leadership adapt to enrich this virtual participation into greater involvement? And finally, how can congregations make the most of technology tools they currently use, and how can they adopt new tools as necessary? What challenges or barriers are congregations encountering when it comes to using technology tools? How can congregations move the use of these tech tools from instrumental to adaptive and use them for the enhancement and flourishing of the congregation into the future? So before we open up the discussion for Q&A, we want to highlight some similarities and differences we see between the Tech in Churches and EPIC projects regarding technology use in congregations. So first, I will hand it over to Sophia to talk about the similarities.
Yes, thanks, Carissa. That was wonderful, really helpful. Yeah, so I think we do see a lot of similarities between the work that we've done and the work that she just kind of went over. I think the main two areas we've highlighted, one is that we both found that the use of virtual worship has increased, again, pretty intuitive with what was demanded of the COVID-19 pandemic. But we did both find that even among rural churches that they did adjust and adapt to virtual worship. And then lastly, we also found that Facebook is one of the places that churches and congregations and leaders went to stream and to connect. And it's been a really vital part of keeping churches together amid social lockdowns and social distancing.
So one difference between the studies can be seen when comparing the use of technology in the life of the church beyond worship services. EPIC data shows that for the most part, congregations have pulled back on offering hybrid or virtual programming outside of worship. Congregations who were once offering a variety of programs online have done away with the online option in favor of in-person only events. In contrast, the Tech in Churches data from their third report show that many churches in their study have continued to go above and beyond when integrating technology in a post-pandemic world. The few programs where the EPIC data did show continued use of virtual options were religious education and adult prayer groups. And then this is then somewhat consistent with how congregations in the Tech in Churches sample are using technological innovations outside of worship. Along those same lines, findings from the two studies differ when comparing the orientation towards change of the congregations. The latest report from Tech in Churches show that given the resources and positive attitude, the congregations in their sample were continuing to innovate. Some of our other EPIC data, which we have talked about in previous webinars, find that congregations in 2023 have become less willing than ever to change to meet new challenges than they were at the height of the pandemic. This difference in findings could be a reflection of when the surveys were fielded and the ensuing change fatigue congregations are encountering as a result of the pandemic. EPIC data shows a sort of rubber band effect where congregations agreed or strongly agreed that they were open to change early in the pandemic, but over time they have snapped back to the lowest percentage of congregations being willing to change that we have ever seen. This could also be possible that receiving a grant for technology invigorated the Tech in Churches congregations and encouraged them to consider new possibilities. Overall, both studies highlight that the role technology plays in congregations is still changing, and congregations are not yet in a place of stasis in terms of their use and long-term plans for hybrid worship. Findings from these two worship projects show that the use of technology is ever changing for congregations as they assess what works for them in the continually evolving post-pandemic reality.
It's been a very rich and interesting conversation we've had today. As I said earlier, we intend to continue to do these webinars at least once a month on the first Thursday of each month. And our next one will be on March 7th, I believe, and it's going to be addressing, again, clergy health and wellness and what can be done with that. So we encourage people to look for the announcement and to sign up. And again, let me thank Dr. Heidi Campbell, Sophia Osteen, and Dr. Mikowski. It's really great to have you all, and this has been a very stimulating conversation. Thank you. And thank all of you for participating, and do come back